Welcome to the TRXL podcast. I'm Evan TRXL. Today I welcome Matt Jezyk to the show. You might recognize his name from my recent campfire episode with Ian Keogh, where he shared the story of Dynamo, an episode I highly recommend checking out if you haven't already. You can find that link in the show notes. Matt has been quietly shaping the tools and technologies that have transformed the AEC industry with over 2 decades of deep experience, and he's played a leading role in the early days of developing some of the most influential platforms in the space: Autodesk Revit, Dynamo, and Project Refinery, to name a few, pushing the boundaries of computational and generative design long before they became formidable tools. He began his journey in architecture, but quickly moved to the software side as a product manager at Charles River Software, also known as Revit Technology Corporation, which was, as we all know, acquired by Autodesk early in the 2000s. There, he served as a senior engineering manager and focused on creating next-gen solutions for AEC workflows. But he didn't stop there. Well, he did stop there for almost 17 years, but then he took his expertise to Tesla and Rivian, where he helped build the systems powering their smart factories, applying his knowledge of design, automation, and software at an entirely different scale. Many lessons were learned, as we'll hear about in this episode. Now, as co-founder and VP of product at Motif, Matt is back in AEC, bringing his journey full circle. He's working with a team that is building a new kind of platform for the architectural design process. In typical fashion for guests on this show, it's forward-thinking, ambitious, and rooted in the belief that better tools lead to better outcomes. Through every chapter of his career, Matt has championed automation, creativity, and cross-disciplinary collaboration. He has a knack for sensing where the industry is going and helping it get there faster. As usual, there's an extensive amount of additional information in the show notes to explore, so be sure to check those out. They are, of course, in your podcast app if you're a paid member, or if you're a free member, you can find them on trxl.co. By the way, Matt does some screen sharing during this episode showing Motif, so check it out on YouTube if you're curious. And while you're there, hit the subscribe button to let me know that you're a fan of the show. On YouTube, just search for TRXL Podcast, that's TRXL Podcast, or find the link in the show notes page at trxl.co. All right, now without any further ado, I bring you my conversation with Matt Jezyk. Matt, great to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
I think it's been a long time coming. We've been, passing in the hallways at Autodesk University over the years. Been stalking you on LinkedIn for years, and you've been probably listening to episodes of the podcast. And now here we finally are in the same place at the same time. It's great.
Yep, same thing. I've enjoyed listening to your podcast. I do have to admit that I listened to them a little bit in like 1.25. 1.5 is a little fast, but 1.25 is like my preferred. But I really like the flow and how number one, the guests that you have, but also just the line of inquiry you go down is really nice to hear.
On my other podcast, just to put a little context around, I totally get the speed thing. I listen to most podcasts at 1.25 or 1.5, but I had another guest on my other show say, I go to sleep with you guys every night.
That's so funny.
And it's like, I don't do that. I don't listen to podcasts in bed because I don't need any extra stimulation. But there's some voices out there that I could see that happening depending on who you're listening to. And then you wouldn't want to be listening at 1.25. You would want to be listening at, the low dulcet tones of the golden microphone and the deep voice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anyway, I thought that was hilarious, but great to have you. And I'm really excited to have a conversation about Motif and what you've been up to. And you've had this really interesting path leading to Motif. And Motif is like this new thing, this new thing that's coming out. And we will definitely get to that point. But I would love it if you would just kind of tell your story about how you got from architecture to various places, maybe back to architecture. But you've had this circuitous path over the last decade plus. Tell us about it.
Great. Yeah. So my background, I went to school for architecture, for building architecture, and then was always into computers as well. So I ended up getting a concentration, sort of a minor in computer science and then business as well. And that served me pretty well. So I practiced in Boston for a couple of years and then ended up joining a startup that had a really mysterious name called Charles River Software back in the day. And that turned into Revit. So there was a small startup of mostly computer science, mathematician people that had built manufacturing CAD, mechanical CAD tools, one called Pro Engineer. And then they were doing the same thing in architecture. So I was one of the first architects that was hired in that team. And we worked together and built this thing. And then got acquired by Autodesk and it did a bunch of stuff after that. So my life has been building software for architects and engineers more so than building buildings myself. But the good thing about that is that you're able to work with people all around the world that are solving some of the hardest problems out there. And you get exposed to that and can collaborate with people, like yourselves and others that, a normal architect that might be working on one particular building might not have had that experience. So yeah. So I've built Revit, built a bunch of other things like computational design tools like Dynamo, generative design, simulation tools, structural analysis, energy analysis, fabrication tools, web, cloud, all that kind of fun stuff. And now we're doing it in Motif. It's a new company. We started about 2 years ago, and some industry veterans kind of came together. But interestingly, all of us that were the founding team, we came from Autodesk, but we all left and went into various manufacturing spaces for a while. So I went into the electric vehicle manufacturing space for about 5-6 years, and learned deeply about like what manufacturing was all about at scale. So how do you not just build one of something, which is what we're really good at in architecture, but how do you build thousands or hundred thousands or millions of something and get that efficiency? And then of course, like scaling, one of the concepts we were working on there was the factory as a product. Like how do you make factories quickly and efficiently and scale them in order to make more and more of particular products like vehicles or batteries. So kind of like learning how to take the best practices for manufacturing and apply them back into architecture is sort of the longer story arc that I'm interested in. But for Motif, like what we're trying to do is coming back from this other industry in manufacturing. How do we build a brand new platform that starts to advance how architectural practice works, how engineering practice works in the building industry, in a similar way to how manufacturing has changed over the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of path, like I was saying a minute ago, how you've gotten to where you are and actually kind of proactively going out of architecture to learn these things and then bring those back into architecture. And I'm just curious kind of what you have brought back from those learning experiences. But we've seen a lot of, these kinds of factories for architecture do a lot of, funding, venture capital funding. We've seen a lot of them crumble under the weight of architecture and manufacturing and just kind of the logistics side of all that. And I'm curious kind of before we get into the Motif side of things, like what can you share from your perspective that is really bringing value to where you are now? Like what are the hard lessons? I mean, there's a ton of hard lessons in there, right? Am I wrong?
No, I think that the trail of sort of modular construction, panelized construction, prefab in general is littered with these sort of corpses of startups that have tried to do something over the last 20 years, and all for the best intentions. I think the problems are not technological. A lot of them come down to the fractured value chain in architecture to begin with, and different building typologies that have different like kind of cost constraints and sort of efficiencies and just the mass production aspect of it in general. So it's like, if you're going to build, like basically every building is like a beta, if you think about it, like there's only one of it, right? So
prototype. Yeah.
It's a prototype. So like, how do you gain the learnings that you do the first time you do that? How do you apply that again and again and again? And that's where you see, things that are repetitive. So hospitality, residential, retail, anything that has a site adapt aspect, like a prototype store, and then a site adapt, like there's a learning and sort of efficiencies, and you lock in vendors and manufacturers to build things for you. WeWork would be a good example of that. I think that in their prime, they were knocking out an amazing amount of square footage just from like an interior fit out standpoint. And at some point they had like about 2.5 or 3 curtain wall plants, like manufacturing plants, locked in to say, just to generate the storefront that they use for their interior partitions. So that's a case that it's not really what you hear about when you think about like, industrialized construction or things that have to do with prefab or modular. But that's the real thing. Like if you take a vertically integrated building typology, you take something like a WeWork kind of space, or take like Hilton hotels or Marriott or something like that, or how many Starbucks are there, Apple stores. If you can lock in the suppliers and the manufacturing process and the efficiencies that you get out of standard details and just kind of like roll them out, that's where it gets interesting. But sadly, that if you think about it as an architectural critic, that just leads to the blandification and sort of urban sprawl of like the sameness everywhere. But I mean that's kind of where the sweet spot is, I think, right now. Interestingly, I don't think residential ever took off. I mean, besides like the initial kind of like Levittown things back in the early 50s, and production home builders, of course, too now. But the things that you would think of as like high design, architecturally significant buildings that are residential, that are able to be mass produced, I think that there's still a big opportunity there that hasn't been addressed. I mean, you mentioned some of the larger flame outs in the past. Katera would come to mind there, where heavily capitalized, amazing ideas, right into issues around scale and production and efficiency. And also just building typology. Like, how do you focus on one particular type of the market? Like, it could be like, I think they were trying to focus on mid-rise residential in like the Southwest. Like, okay, like nail that market and don't try and do it in the Pacific Northwest. It's just different. Or the Southeast and different, sort of densities of units and things like that. That's the problem, is like, it's not a one size fits all. And I think that's one of the siren songs that people hear about in manufacturing. They're like, oh, I know how to make widgets, or I know how to make these, circuit boards at scale. And then I'm just going to scale that up and make a building. It doesn't really work that way, for all the reasons that you've mentioned before.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how these companies have failed by trying to be too much. Like they're just trying to take on more than like your example of just focusing on this one thing. Do you think that that's really coming, like that pressure is coming from the funding mechanism of these startups, where it's like you've got to be this 100x return kind of a company for those VCs? And because I don't know if it's possible to achieve that by being so focused on a market and a region and a delivery type, right? It's like whatever those components that make up what this modular prefab companies are doing. It's like, no, we can do it all. And I think by thinking we can do it all, it gets really, really, like, it just waters it down and makes it really difficult then to solve for all those different markets and all those different environments. And I mean, Lance Amato came on the show a long time ago and said there's something like 30,000 different municipalities in the U.S. and everyone's got a different version of code adoption, for example, right? Like these constraints are wild in the architectural practice, and the construction industry. So it's really that as soon as people start to try to go wide, it's like then you really notice that it kind of tends to fall apart.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's true. I think the standard VC sort of mantra is like, they're looking for the unicorns, the kind of 10x or 20xers. So if you put in,
I said 100, that's probably not the right number.
I mean, yeah, hundreds are great. Yeah, but like, I think, I mean, the fact of the matter is, for VCs, it's like, and you can look up the metrics. It's like, say they put money in 20 companies, they really just need one hit, and then the rest of them are not going to do that great.
Yeah.
But how big is that hit? And that's where the return, like if you take, an iPhone app like that, the cost of goods for that is relatively low, and the sort of size of that market, the total addressable market or TAM, can be very large. And if you monetize that, it's like just a money printing machine. That doesn't happen, and you're dealing with like real physical products and real big things that take time and permits and zoning and people. Yeah. It doesn't scale that way. So I think that's usually the kind of natural limit or constraint in some of these is you have a heavily regional, market. You have a particular set of buildings or typologies that will work well and lend themselves to mass production. And then you have the sort of upside of like, who's going to buy it, who's going to use it. I think that there are solvable problems there, but I don't think traditional venture capital is really the best kind of fuel or funding mechanism for a lot of those right now. I mean, there are some VCs that are not interested in the quick return, the kind of 2 to 3 to 4 or 5 year return. They're interested in a 10-year return. And I think at that scale and at that time horizon, I think it is possible. And also, I mean, there's other kind of, I hate to say it, but like resiliency at a national level or at a government funding level is useful. Like if you think about how do you recover from a natural disaster? How do you build housing in the Southeast after horrible, hurricanes had happened, or in LA recently after the fires, like that? There could be kind of an instigation or a kickstarting from a funding mechanism at the state or municipal or even the federal level that could give a signal to the market to say, hey, we're interested in doing something there. That's actually happening in other countries. In Canada, in Vancouver, there's a really great kind of public-private thing that's happening with a company called Intelligent Factories, Intelligent Cities, yeah. So that's a really great model. And there's some other ones in Europe too that are amazing. But in the US, I think it's a little tricky. But I think that it is something that people will crack over time. But for right now, as you mentioned, it seems like there's this siren song for high-end residential, high design, high-end residential, and factory built or kind of prefab modular. But I'm not sure if that's really where like someone's going to win, I guess. Yeah. And it's probably going to be more on the, I think WeWork is like one of those examples that worked. I think, I hate to say it, but like retail is a good one. There's these old examples of you used to be able to buy an Irish bar in shipping containers. Like they would literally design and build an Irish bar, and you could put it in 2 shipping containers and ship it to like Malaysia and set up an Irish bar just because it's in a kit, so like, why, that's basically the same way that like Starbucks works or like Apple stores work. It's like, they're not really all site built. There's a bunch of pre-created components that show up on site and get positioned in the right way.
For the ones that go into like a strip mall or infill type of a project where it's an existing framework and then they just need to set it up a box within a box kind of a thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but I think in that space, you can use technology to kind of tie back to this and software to identify the opportunities and look at zoning and look at other kind of infill sort of site opportunities and what's possible, and obviously parametrically configure things and figure out cost and efficiency. That there's a couple startups that are doing interesting work there. And then the other side of it is just figuring out how to take a design and break it down into smaller pieces that can be fabricated. So it's a solvable technology problem, but that's not the constraint. It's more on the market and the financials behind it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I think about like the automotive industry, the EV industry that you are in, and kind of the repeatability of those and like for example, you look at some of these cars and like they don't change the model if they don't have to, right? Like they're, especially in the EV space, because it's all about that factory and it's all about kind of stretching that as long as possible. And in architecture, I mean, you're talking about like really wild and volatile market conditions when it comes to pricing of commodity pieces parts, right, that go into building all that stuff. And you also have wild labor fluctuations. I mean, maybe the factories solve for that a little bit better than traditional, build on site kind of stuff, where it's really difficult sometimes to get the right crew on the job at the right time, especially in certain locations over others where there may not be as many people in that industry or, businesses that could bid on a project. It just, and I think about kind of the time horizon that VCs are comfortable with that kind of return and how long these projects take to do. Obviously, they're trying to compress those schedules in massive ways to make that throughput, potential being there and doing a lot of work in a shorter amount of time. But man, this is a tough business to apply that kind of thinking to. And I find it interesting that you're on the software side of it, right? You're not in the physical side of it, because on the software side of it, if you can gain those efficiencies and make them really tricked out for different verticals operating in the architecture delivery space, Talk about that as we kind of lead into where you're at now and why you decided to kind of get out of the EV industry and take what you've learned and apply it back to the AEC industry.
Definitely. I mean, so in the EV side, we were, it's actually kind of cool. It's like designing 3 different things at once. You design the product, like the vehicle.
Because you were on the facilities side, like, to be totally clear about that, right? You talked about kind of these factories and putting factories places. You weren't designing cars.
Yeah, I wasn't designing the product, but I was designing the process, like the robots and the assembly lines to make them, and then the building to house and feed the process to make the product. So there's kind of like 3 different design process. Like, there's the design of the car, and then there's the design of like, how do you get all the parts to the line to make the car in the right efficiency, and how many robots do you use versus people and all that. And then there's now there's 16 different systems of like compressed air, of nitrogen, of gas and electricity that need to go to those lines, and you make a building around that. So yeah, we were connecting what are called the manufacturing engineers that were making the design ideas for the vehicle with the building engineers, and making sure that those 3 different design processes were as efficient as possible. Because, like everything else, if something changes and then you try and build them and it doesn't line up, then that's a cost overrun or a delay. So that was kind of cool. And then using that idea of a factory as a product, like building multiple of them because they're basically the same, is where you get the economies of scale. So I was doing that, but then I got super deep into the design of the factories and how to make that efficient, how to tie it to generative design and optimization and those kinds of things. So that was kind of cool. But back on leaving that space. So I stood up things at a company, Tesla, and then one at Rivian. We worked on those kind of 2 different companies. But then about a little more than 2 years ago, one of my old bosses, Amar Hansball, he was the co-CEO at Autodesk, called me up and said, "Hey, I've got some ideas that I'd like to work with you on, and let's see if we can spin up a new company." And that was the formation for what we're working on now, which is this thing called Motif. And that was literally the case where he was at a company called Berate Machines with our CTO, Brian Matthews, and our chief design officer, Lira Nikolovska. So they were all working on basically building what are called micro factories, like pre-configurable, almost like Lego blocks that make it easier to make products. They were doing that for a while instead of doing design. And then we all kind of came back together and literally got the band back together to start to address how can we build the next generation of design tools for architects and engineers. So based on some of the learnings that we've had, but also just kind of looking at the industry from fresh eyes, like after being away from Autodesk for a while and not really thinking about like what the next version of Revit is or whatever. It's just like, you come back and you look at the problems and like, oh man, things haven't really advanced that much at all. Yeah. So what are the opportunities now based on the technology available, how the generational shift is happening? Like, I don't want to design for me. I'm a middle-aged white guy. I want to design for people that are in college now, that are in a design undergrad or graduate degree, because their view of the world is remarkably different than mine. And and that we're looking at these things from like a generational standpoint. Like, what's the 25-year return? Like things like AutoCAD and Revit and Rhino and SketchUp been around for a while. Revit is turning 25 years old this year. So not even old enough to drink, but like old enough to rent a car now. It's like, that's like the big thing. So how do we like that, like, and I can't even teach my son these tools, because they're going to be like, this is broken. Like, this is not how I think. This kid, my son, just speaking of that way, he grew up playing Minecraft and programming when he was like in 7th grade, and Roblox, and like the always on kind of instantaneous aspect of, connectivity with his friends and how they work together. And then the tools that he's using professionally, like we talked about music, are all on the web. They are all significantly connected together. Why do we not have tools like that for our industry that are just how people expect to work these days? And we can get into that a little bit more.
Let's take a short break from the conversation to invite you to join the most influential technology leaders in the AEC industry at Confluence. Composed of in-person events and a podcast co-hosted by yours truly, Confluence is designed to foster conversations between AEC firms and technology companies so they can learn, share, and engage with each other to support industry innovation. Software company AVAIL, which creates content management solutions for the AEC industry, started hosting Confluence events in 2019 to understand what firms are needing, wanting, and thinking around technology. To learn more about Confluence, explore upcoming events, and listen to podcast episodes, go to confluence.getavail.com. My thanks to Confluence for supporting this episode of the TRXL podcast. And now, let's get back to the conversation. So you've got this seasoned team, and you said got the band back together. And in this term, this example might be debatable, but you're the new kids on the block. Motif just came out of stealth, and yet you've been around the block quite a few times, and the people on your team have as well. And I'm really curious how you are looking at this product through the lens of the next generation, because that to me is kind of a fascinating thing. Like, of course you could make a new version of the old thing, right? You could trim off things, and you could polish things, and you could, move the UI around and put it on the web and call it done, right? But I think there's probably more to it, and I would love to kind of hear your take on how you're going about doing that.
Sure. So I think the key thing here that we're looking at is desktop software. Silos of information, proprietary file formats are, how people are used to working today. But if you look at anything else that you've touched, recently, like how you pay your taxes, how you pay your bills, how you interact with your bank, where you get your music from, all those things are not tied to your computer and your files anymore. They're usually on the web and in the cloud. Mm-hmm. So why is our professional practice and our design sort of standard still tied up in that? And that's where the industry's been going for a while. But one of the things that we saw as we've formed this new company, and as we started working with a set of early adopter, we call them design partner, sort of customers or sort of partners, if you think about it, in the US and over in Europe, we started asking them questions like, what do you guys see as the main challenges? Like, and a lot of this did come from, the open letters that were started a few years ago. There's a set of pretty bright individuals over in Europe that really started to articulate.
Point out the obvious.
Yeah, they're starting to articulate the real problems, like not just with a technology or a product or something like that, but just like, here's how the industry needs to work. And here's how we want to work in our practice. And here's how we're looking for someone to help us in that journey. Yeah. So we saw that as a pretty good signal. And obviously everybody's been working with these guys for a long time, but working with them and others, they were able to show us how practice is changing. And one of the things that happened a little bit before the pandemic, but also accelerated dramatically during the pandemic, was the adoption of these sort of infinite canvas whiteboarding tools. So people usually reference a software called Figma, which is not really that well used and well understood in architecture, but it's very common in software design, user experience, product design world. And that is the equivalent would be like take Adobe InDesign or, Illustrator and make it work on the web, make it work in a way that you don't really have a bound sort of canvas. Like that's why it's called Infinite Canvas, and works at different levels of scale and detail and is inherently collaborative. Like that's the key thing, is that it's multi-user, multiplayer from the start. It's easy to share ideas and bring people into projects. Like that sort of phenomenon of like always on, always accessible and easy to share with others, I think sparked something in our industry where it's the opposite. It's like not always on, not always up to date, not easy to share versus these online tools. But like I said, so Figma's not really used that much, but you'll hear that from a lot of startups is like, it's like Figma for BIM or Figma for Revit.
Right.
That plays well in the VC community because they understand it as a touchstone, but in the regular architecture community, the other infinite canvas tools that people are using are Miro or Mural, or these kind of applications that literally took the place of a physical whiteboard in a conference room that people would come together and pin up and get ideas together and do charrettes and design critique kind of work. They needed a way to do that, remote cross time and space, but also forcing function when people were not in offices anymore. How do you practice architecture when you can't collaborate together in real time and in the same space? So there was a heavy pickup of these tools, and they're actually really easy to use. You can get the principal level architect to be using it in the same way that a junior architect or someone else can use it. You can get contractors, you can, bring cross-disciplinary work together. It's sort of like lowest common denominator from like a tool set, but also that is the beauty of it too. You don't have to be a computational design person. You don't have to be the chief parametric person in your company to use one of these tools. So there's been it's really interesting phenomenon there. So how do you use that to inform the next level of design tools too? Because there are problems with this tool. Like they're two-dimensional. Like, so architects and engineers work in 3D. We solve three-dimensional problems, but now you're dealing with an artifact of that, a screenshot, if you will. Like, let me send a screenshot from Rhino or Revit to put on this board, and we could sketch on top of it, and then remember what we were talking about later on. Like those kind of, that level of invisible work, or sort of Phil Bernstein used to call it like a sawtooth diagram. Like you're building up information and then it drops down because you've exported or you've dumped it out to a different format.
Some kind of information, right?
Right. So
it's
like
inherently lossy, right? This process that we go through. It's like somebody leaves a firm, loss, right? Somebody retires, loss. Somebody, you get to a certain milestone in the project and then looks good, start over kind of a thing. And it's like, so that's what that sawtooth, it kind of, so if you imagine, if you haven't seen this diagram, it's like the profile of the Sydney Opera House, right? It's like up and then a steep drop and then up again in another arc and then another steep drop, and it keeps going. And that's just kind of this linear, if you think about it kind of linearly, that's how data loss or decision making happens throughout the life of a project.
Absolutely. So that's kind of where we're starting with Motif, is what if we took the best things from these other applications and made them more purpose built for architects and engineers? Like these tools that are being used today are great. People are using them day in and day out, but they're a little bit misappropriated because they are inherently two dimensions and they don't really have an understanding of how the building goes together or other concepts. They're just kind of like looking at literally a photocopy. So that was kind of the essence of the idea. So what we're building is a new platform, and that will take time to do. You don't rebuild, the primary design applications in this industry overnight. It takes time. But what we have is a platform that can grow to be that. And the first application or the first manifestation of this is focused on basically design review, collaboration, markup, commenting, and is meant to be a complementary tool with the primary design applications. Like if you spend your day in Rhino, like right now, there's not really a great way to collaborate across different teams using Rhino. How do you do that today? How do you share that information or kind of link those things together? And how do you do it with Revit or SketchUp or Grasshopper or Dynamo? Like those kinds of things, people are using them. There's a heavy investment in those applications, and that's not going to change overnight. But how can we work on like the interstitial tissue that connects these things together and ultimately makes the design a team sport again, where you can share your ideas more effectively inside your company or outside with other people, or even with the client or with the public. Case in point, like they're building a new high school where I live, like in north of Philadelphia, south of New York. And the state of the art is I'm going to show up with a physical model and a SketchUp model and a PowerPoint to a public meeting every month to talk about the design. And there's a good facilitation process. And what if we did this or that? But it's not, the artifacts are not really supporting that design process or the review or collaboration process with whoever the other person is, whether it's the client or the general public or the structural engineer or anybody else. They're just kind of someone sitting there taking notes and has to take them back to the office and give them to the drafter to pick up something. So how can we bring that into this century and make it digital, make it trackable, observable, and visible to people that don't have a professional background or software? They could just log in and see the status of these things.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear about how you're doing that, because like you talk about kind of these artifacts, right, that are created as like a snapshot in time, right? And that is how architects have worked forever, right? Like these phases of delivery, it's always that, right? It's like conceptual design, schematic design, design development, construction documents, right? And it's like at each one of those phases, and it used to be, right, you would only get renderings at the end of DD kind of a thing. And again, that artifact. And now like the expectations of clients have shifted a lot over the years with the advent of new technology, like real-time rendering, for example, right? Where it's just like, because what used to happen was they would say, can I get updated renderings? And it was like, no, you can't, right? And now it's like, of course, renderings are free. Here they are. And here's the latest screen grabs, right, of the model that we can then send to you because they're good enough, right? They're the real time with all the asset libraries and all of that stuff just makes it like, okay, yeah, it doesn't have to go to the Viz department first anymore. A designer can just send those directly to a client, but there's still kind of like this artifact nature. It's not real time in that process of, and again, like our contracts are kind of set up that way, and our billing departments are set up that way, and there's so many things that are still kind of holding on to or making it so that we need to hold on to these older ways of doing things. But then you're also talking about the next generation of people who are going to be using it, and what do they expect? What do you mean, like, that's not a live update? What do you mean, like, I can't log in and see the latest, greatest? And so having a place for the next generation, or the currently adventurous people in our generations, right, who are willing to do that, it's a new way of working, and it's a new workflow. And I'm curious to just kind of hear like what that is like for you as you roll these things out. Like you have these partner firms who are probably legacy firms, right? Like they've been around a while, and of course they want to be modern and current and be differentiated in some way or do things better. And at the same time, they're dealing with all of these other things that are kind of holding us to these legacy models like delivery methods and the way that standard of care works in the practice of architecture and contracts and all of these things. So I'm just curious, like what's that been like for you guys as you're developing a new platform, a new way of working within an industry that's been around forever?
Oh, yeah. No, it's a good point. I think, first off, we know that drawings are not going to go away. As much as you can look to the future and say, we're going to build off of models, sure, like that's possible. But drawings are artifacts that are contractually mandated and represent those milestones that you mentioned. So having a way to manage those is super important, but having them not be derivative, like having them be tied to the actual design or the work product itself and sort of one thing I think actually Revit got pretty right was the ability for a view to be live, where if you see something that's wrong on a plan view or a sheet, you could go in and just modify it right there. You don't have to go back to the model and change it and then see the result on the drawing. So thinking about a drawing as the expression of your design intent and how you convey that information is actually super useful. But also having them be artifacts that can be pinned in time to say, hey, this is what this background 80% set look like on Friday. That's a moment, that's a release, that's a deliverable. So that's super important. One thing that we have heard, interestingly, is that if you think about how that works now is that people, are working in their primary design tool and then they generate a bunch of drawings and usually it's all PDFs right now and you generate whatever, 400, 500 PDFs and toss them over the wall.
My cohort my co-host on my other podcast, he just delivered a set of drawings that was over 2,500 sheets, like
wow.
eight buildings, like not just one building, right? But still,
it's massive, right? But like, how do you even add, if you were the project architect, you're kind of principal level person, how do you contribute effectively to that team? Which, whatever, metric you have of like people to like produced sheets and whatever, but it's, these teams can be somewhere between 10 to 30, 40 people.
Yeah.
And they're generating massive amounts of drawing. Like, how do you review them? How do you mentor younger people? How do you even understand what your professional liability is?
How do you keep an eye on it?
You know?
Yeah. I mean, like you talk about like doing work in an office under the observation of an architect. And is that architect truly doing that? Like that is actually what your license says that you're to do, right? So
yeah.
it's an incredibly difficult thing in the paradigm of creating buildings today, right? At the complexity and the CYA that goes on in these drawings and in these specifications and all of these different things. Because I mean, and I was going to bring this up earlier when you talk about like there is no hub, right? There's so many ways to do there are hubs, right? But there's so many ways to share things and there are so many ways to collaborate and there are so many places to like stuff files. And is it in the team? Is it in Teams? Is it on the server? Is it in your email? Like, where is it? I don't know. And so much so that companies have gotten to the point where they're just like, I don't care where you put it. Like we try to pull it all together because we basically declared bankruptcy and said there's no way we can force people to put stuff in the right place. It doesn't happen, right? Like especially during the pandemic, it was like, where's the file? Who knows, right? It's somewhere, and if that person's offline, like you got to wait till they're back online to find it, right? And so, man, it's really complex at this stage. And so to your point about just keeping your eye on things and reviewing things and contributing in the role that you have as that senior level person who is technically supposed to do that, it's so hard, right? It's just honestly really difficult.
Yeah. So I think, one of the things that we see as an opportunity is imagine, you're running a mid-sized, project, whatever, the 400,000 square foot office fit out or something. You're going to a job meeting, you have to fly, you have to go somewhere. The state of the art now is send me those PDF files and I'll look at them in Bluebeam or, whatever other PDF markup tool of choice. But what happens to anything you contribute there or ideas that you have or, information you want to share back to the team? It's sort of a little bit lost. And that's one thing that even in one thing that we've heard a lot is like the kind of pointy-haired bosses, if you will, feel disassociated from the work. And it, like we're all kind of mid-career professionals, like, you might have been very adept project architect, technical person in these tools and working before, but now you're running around at meetings and, dealing with budgets and contracts.
Role. Yeah.
So, but how do you contribute? You don't want to give that person a Revit seat. You don't want them messing around with that model. You don't even want them.
Absolutely.
So like, what do you do?
Don't touch the model. Right.
So like, what if that person is sitting on the tarmac at LAX, like waiting to take off and had their iPad and was able to just log into this thing and see the design? And it wasn't in Revit. It wasn't in Bluebeam. It was just in this new thing called Motif that super clean, easy to use, but always up to date. The models are all linked and shared so that you see the right 3D information and the right 2D information. And you can contribute, you can have a conversation, you can sketch on top of these things. And have comments that go back to the rest of the team as if you were there. So as if you said, hey, print out this thing for me. I want to show you how we did this detail 5 years ago. That's the type of mentoring and sort of professional practice that is very common, but it only works well when you're face to face. What if you could do that more remotely and still feel like you're contributing? And it's not a review process, it's a participation process and contribution and mentoring opportunity that we think is missing in some of these current tools. And it also lets people kind of feel disassociated. Like, I don't even know what this team is doing right now. I hope this is okay, but how do I review that? I don't have time to go through that. How do I even know what to look at? So those kinds of things are opportunities for a collaboration tool to bring people together in the same way that you would expect in any other tool these days. It's like, you just show up, you're there physically, either the same time and space or asynchronously leaving comments and marking things up. But those are all tracked in sort of Google Docs style that you can observe, go back to, see who changed what, when, and how, and then respond to and deal with actions.
This sawtooth idea that you talked about with Phil's kind of chart that he showed, and how just to kind of put a diagram to it, a visual to it, to say, okay, I get that. What you're talking about now, I think, changes that, right? Like that's definitely why we're talking about what we're talking about, right? It's this idea of that data loss, the downward part of that chart, minimized or going away. I don't know where you guys see that actually going. But the idea of not having that data loss then, to me, opens up another potential problem, which is just accumulation over time, which is what designs are, right? It goes from 30,000 feet down to the smallest detail, but it's also like the number of parts goes up, the number of decisions goes up, like all of these things are going up, 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 up. And so I'm wondering, like, how does a system like yours accommodate for that? Because I don't want to wade through more and more stuff all the time, right? I want to go in there and see what I need to see without having to jump those hurdles to get, okay, what are we talking about? Where do I find it? Because infinite canvas is not necessarily a good thing, right? It's like, exactly, focus here, right? This is what we're talking about. So maybe you can just kind of talk to that part of it.
So I think what we can do is just talk a little bit conceptually. Do you mind if I just share screen?
No, go for it.
It's easy to show some graphics here.
Okay, so for those of you, Matt's going to share a screen. For those of you who are listening on the podcast, you might want to go over to YouTube. I'll have a link in the show notes to the YouTube version of this show, so that you can see what he's doing. And we'll do our best to describe it if you're not going to do that.
Yeah, so hopefully I can describe it. So, okay, this seems like it will work. And I promise this is not going to be super salesy or anything, but this is basically the area we're working in. Where design happens is in these desktop tools, where collaboration happens is in these kind of new whiteboardy tools. So what if you could do both? And that's kind of what Motif is. So it's meant to be a new platform to handle architectural design. And to your point, Evan, about like different densities of information and focus, like that's inherently built into this. Like the level of information that we have is very deep. Like there's a lot of information, but you don't need to see it all at one time. There's ways to parse that information out and make it understandable and also consumable by different audiences. So we can talk about that. So we this is what we talked about a kind of 20 minutes ago, just the overall space that we're operating in. And we're building a new platform that can handle different levels of information, but meant to encompass the overall architecture, engineering, sort of information density problem, and then combining 2D and 3D information together. But the way that we're actually doing that is by segmenting out projects into different boards. So if you've ever used these other applications, they have an interface kind of like this, where you have a project and then you have these discrete spaces to come work in, and it's called an infinite canvas board, that you can have one that's focused on, this is where we're going to do our brainstorming or bring material samples together, or this one is focused on 2D sheet review or 3D model review, or exploring 4 different options for the entryway or something like that. So however you want to organize your work is there. but the project contains all of your models, all of your ideas, all of your images, all your PDF files, really any information that you need to execute the project. And that could live either directly in Motif, or it could be linked. It could be pulling that information in from other places. So we're, to your point before, like there's no single source of truth. Like there's no, everything is collaboration. So go where that information lives and pull it into this, or provide a link is basically our philosophy. But back on the idea of like, how do I even find the right things in an infinite canvas? What we found just working with people is that they organize their work in that way. Like, okay, this is our 80% check set board to take a look at something. And then that is a container that people can work in, and, you know, any of the comments or markups in there make sense in that, sort of for that activity. But there might be other ones too. So we're not pre-designing that for people. It's just kind of a general purpose tool, but all of your information is accessible, over the history of the project.
Let's take a quick break from the conversation to tell you about AVAIL. Is your team struggling to find the BIM assets they need? AVAIL's content management system simplifies access to all of your firm's content in one easy-to-use platform. No matter where your files live or what type of files they are, you can easily search and access them from AVAIL. Now, designers can consistently find and reuse all types of content. So what does that mean? Well, standards compliant models and drawings are easier to create. The documentation process is less chaotic. New hires are easier to onboard. Projects are delivered faster with fewer errors. You get the idea. Visit getavail.com to try AVAIL for free and request a free demo. That's getavail.com, GETAVAIL.com. My thanks to AVAIL for supporting this episode of the TRXL podcast. And now let's get back to the conversation. Yeah, and I like what you're talking about when it comes to like, okay, the source of information is the authoring package that it was created in, right? And it's brought into here. This is kind of an assembly of parts for a conversation, for a collaboration, for a presentation, depending on who the stakeholders are, right? But this gives everybody a place to do that function of moving the project forward, making decisions that needs to happen in a group setting or a collaborative setting or in a presentation to get that feedback from a client, let's say. But like the Revit stuff's in Revit and the Rhino stuff's in Rhino, and those really advanced operators of those things are still doing their thing in those packages, right?
Exactly. And this is directly coming from our conversations with our design partners, where, you know, everyone wants a new great 3D design platform. Like that's not a secret in this industry, right? So like,
right.
Yes. But also there's like practical switching costs. Like, okay, like, you know, how long will it take to build something that's equivalent to
maturity of a product? Yeah. Right.
And also, even if there was something today, like, I mean, I was around when we got people to use Revit instead of AutoCAD. Like that was a fairly fundamental switching cost of like 2D to 3D, parametrics, all that kind of stuff.
Fundamental's one way to say it. I mean, it was painful, right? It like to get experienced operators from one to the other. Like how many times was like the flag goes up and it's like, I surrender, export to AutoCAD now, right? Because
exactly. Yeah.
How many times did that happen? Many.
So we're not doing that right now. Like we're trying to build a new platform where you design where you want to design. You design in Revit, you design in Rhino, SketchUp, you know, AutoCAD, whatever, you know, Figma. Grasshopper, Dynamo, Figma, you know, it's like, and you're linking that information in a dynamic way. So it's not a static thing where I take a screenshot from Rhino. You're bringing in the Rhino file and you can make that right, you know, moment or view, and show the right information in this system and bring it together and mash it up with other things. So that's kind of where we're going right now. And you can operate in 2D or 3D. So you take that project architect person that might be really good at sketching ideas or detailing something out. How do you give them a space that they can draw in? Like right now, they're actually drawing in, scarily enough, like Bluebeam or even like, you know, in PowerPoint, drawing details. Like why not have something that's a little bit more architectural in nature that understands units and scale and, materiality and things like that to express your design ideas in. But still with a very elegant, simple user interface that doesn't require you to be a CAD jockey or a computational kind of nerd to do that work. So that's kind of what we're trying to build in this tool. Is it's not replacing the primary design applications currently. It's meant to be complementary. It's meant to be a collaboration tool that takes the best of these kind of 2D infinite canvas tools and lets you do that work, but also lets you express your ideas in 3 dimensions, and using that same simple tool set of sketching with a pen or a pencil or your finger, do that directly in 3D as well. So that's kind of the essence of what we're building right now, is something that's simple, easy to use, and works directly with the primary design tools in a way that we think matches where the industry is going around how people work in real time, collaboration, expecting information to be there consistently. We're showing on the screen right now just our whole team collaborating directly on building a presentation and a mood board or sort of precedent study directly. Like why should it be someone is in the InDesign file and I'll let you know what I'm done, or here's a new PDF file, like here's the artifact, like right here, let's all work on it together. And everybody contributes and participates and provides their best ideas at that point. And then of course you can be the critic or the markup person and say, no, that's all wrong. Sketch on top of this and say, have you thought about this idea? You don't need to be generating. You could actually just be advising or modifying or mentoring on top of that too. That's a very important part of all of this process. So that's what we're trying to support, but not just in 2 dimensions. It's also in a 3-dimensional space as well. So.
One of the things that you showed me earlier in this 3D space that I thought was, just to really speak to this idea of how architects actually work is, cutting a section using the section box in Revit and then seeing that in Motif and then sketching over the top of it. But, we've done this forever, right? It's like roll out the trace, sketch literally over the top of whatever that predetermined view was. But what was different was that the sketches that people, like it's happening on the screen right now, that's actually in 3D, right? It's like linked to the model and the view. And so you get kind of that, like we talked earlier about somebody who has all this experience adding value to the process, being able to do that with a tool that they understand. They don't have to go into Revit to do this. And we're also not extracting and abstracting this information away from the authoring tool. Like this is kind of a sweet little middleman kind of effort here where it's like I can draw right on top of the model with a tool I understand, but it's literally linked to the 3D elements, which then can go back to the person doing the authoring in that original program. They can actually see it and they can understand it because it's linked to, and I can actually rotate the view, right? Like I don't have to go back to this snapshot, this 2-dimensional overlay like it would happen if you did it in Bluebeam or Miro or whatever, right? It's actually 3D.
Exactly. So that's really the essence of this thing. I mean, drawing is a creative act. It's meant to be expressive and helps people understand your thought process. So why not have that work in the primary environment, like in your 3D environment, and not a derived thing? Sketching on top of a PDF file is sort of a waste of time sometimes because you're not able to convey the same information. So we felt it was pretty strong requirement to get sketching working natively in the 3D scene. So as you rotate the model, or it just kind of knows where that sketch is, and having that be real time so you can express not just the artifact, but the process that you use to get to that point. Like, drawing as a means to express your thoughts and get them across to others is super important. So that's exactly how it works. So currently you can mash up, like in this case, we're seeing a Revit file and a Rhino file mashed up together. The Revit is the architecture and the structure, and the Rhino is going to be a great ceiling feature that's digitally fabricated. You can pull them all together. So similar to how you can work in like Navisworks or, other collaboration tools, but ironically, it's not just about clash detection. It's about how do we design this thing? How do we connect these things together and figure out how they're going to work structurally or architecturally, and use that to change the original source, like the Rhino file or the Revit file, to mediate or respond to, that dance of like, if you move this thing, I'll move that. So this system in Motif captures that collaboration in its purest form, the sketching, the commenting, the sort of negotiation of who's going to do what, and then showing those real-time changes. So as what we're seeing on the screen, I just changed the Revit model to add some structural beam to hang this thing. And then we changed the Rhino file to add some brackets and some hanging rods. That's immediately there. That's not waiting for it to sync to the cloud or I'll give that to you next Tuesday. It's just there. Collaboration should happen in that space.
Very cool. And for those of you, again, who aren't watching, there is a visual component to the things that Matt and I are talking about happening in the YouTube version of this right now. If you're on YouTube, sorry, you get to hear me talk about it like I'm not talking to you. But the visual really helps kind of solidify what we're talking about. A visual example is always beneficial, I think, to me and this audience, because we're visually inclined, maybe more so than others. But I think it really does kind of help. And one of the things that I loved was when, somebody sketched in kind of a section profile onto this building, and then we zoomed in and we rotated, and that section stayed in 3D space, kind of where it was drawn. And I think it's really interesting that you said that the system just kind of knows where that's supposed to be. I assume you're drawing this like on a tablet or something, and you're literally drawing it on top of a 3D view, and yet it lives in 3D space, which I think is pretty cool. I mean, that to me is something actually new that I haven't seen before.
Exactly. And that's exactly how it works. We're working in a 3D scene. The geometry can be created directly in Motif, or it can be brought in from Revit or Rhino or other tools. That if it comes in from those, it's updating live. If you change something, like you add a wall or move a window, it'll update. But the information you're adding on top of Motif is also geometry. So I can sketch that with a mouse. I can sketch it with I use a Surface Book with a pen. You could use your iPad with an Apple Pencil, or even your finger. Like a lot of our displays are multi-touch, capacitance screens anyway. You can just start noodling around with just your finger. And that's the idea. So you're capturing those, and they're not precious. It's not a detail that's going to be, printed. It's just capturing the essence of an idea in a way that can be conveyed to other people, and facilitate the next level of conversation.
Yeah, that to me is really the benefit of a lot of these tools that we're seeing show up on the market. Like there's a lot of multiplayer stuff happening right now in the browser, because the browser kind of agnostifies, it's not the right word, but democratizes access, let's say, to this kind of stuff. And it does seem to me that this really is table stakes. And as a designer from a previous era, if you want to call it that, right? It doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but maybe it is. I got the idea of real-time collaboration potentially all the time is kind of terrifying, I have to say, right? It's like, to me, like it makes sense when it makes sense. And then a lot of the other time, like I just want to be left to my own devices. This platform pretty much sets you up for that. You could work either way, right? You could be working together all the time, but also because you're pulling in information from other sources and like real-time linking that stuff together, it still gives me the ability to go back to my authoring program for those parts of it and work on them there, in isolation, for better or worse, so that I have that control, that as a control enthusiast designer, right? That's where I like to, that's where I want to make those decisions. I want to decide the proportions. I want to decide the materials. Because that's my role on the project. That seems like you're kind of getting the best of both worlds, and I'm curious, like what is the feedback you're getting on stuff like this? I mean, obviously you've pursued this. I assume that is maybe the feedback that you've gotten and that you're pursuing, like because it makes sense to a lot of architects. But also thinking about it from that through the lens of the next generation and expectations and all those things. Like, just because that's the way I wanted to do it doesn't mean it's going to be like that forever. So I'm just curious, like, what the feedback is that you've gotten that's really brought you to this point. Is it like there's tons of people who just say, I want to work collaboratively way more often because I learn more, or whatever those reasons are? What have you heard?
Absolutely. I think it's both. I think it's just human nature. It's not really the way architects or engineers work. It's just sometimes you're working on your own thing. You really got to work out an idea. You have to work out some fundamental principle and you're not ready to share it yet. Mm-hmm. And that's supported in the system too. So yeah, you can leave your things off in your own space and only share them when you're ready. And then other times it really is this, hey, let's just get the four best minds together and just have at it and have a brainstorming session. But that is, a balance. So sometimes you might need to go away for 2 days and just think about something and work it out. And then you're ready to share it and present it. So absolutely, that's just human nature. It's just how people work, and that's supported.
So do you see this as a paradigm shift? Do you see this as an evolution, revolution? Like, where is this on the scale of tools for architects?
Yeah, I think where we are right now is meant to be a connective tissue. I think like we're building a new platform that will be the next platform. But right now, what it is it's not on a day-to-day basis. You're using your main design tool, and that's not going to change. The thing that will supercharge is this thing can look over your shoulder and watch what you're doing and bring that into a shared environment that can help you do some of the things that might be difficult or hard or tedious right now a little bit more easily than before. But the thing that happens in startups, which is really interesting, is that it's not just about the first thing that you put out, it's about every other thing that you put out after that and how quickly you can put out more things. So because we're a small startup, it's all web and cloud, we can put out new versions of the software every month, say, for example, and add more and more capabilities over time. So that's something that you'll see here too, is that this is going to be a journey, and it's going to be a pretty fast journey. There's going to be some pretty large changes, both on how we bring features out to the collaboration environment that we're talking about, but also how we go beyond that into other spaces, like around the 3D modeling or parametrics or machine learning or AI. Like all those things are facilitated by this platform that we have in place.
Can you talk about that from like a user's perspective and what you're hearing? Because to me, adding features without my explicit say so, yes, I'm going to install the new version. I mean, I've brought it up on this podcast before. I remember a project manager was like, are you serious? There's another new version of Revit. And that was every year. Yeah. That was only every year, right? Mm-hmm. And it was like, can we just slow down a little bit? Because like it's hard, like, and those were back in the days when it's like you don't dare like take your model from this version to the next version because you don't know what it's going to break, right? So it's different. But I'm just curious from your guys' point of view. Obviously, when you say it, it makes a lot of sense. Yep. I mean, it's cloud-based. We're releasing new features. The software's getting better and better. And at the same time, you've got people who are like, oh, you moved my button, right? Like, what did you do, right?
Totally. Yeah. And I can argue both sides of that too. Like, I mean, think about your phone. Like, we're an Apple family, so we have all iPhones. I have an Android phone as well, just for testing. But the number of updates that happen is fairly frequent. Like every
there's definitely been some other things going on in the world that have kind of brought us up to temperature for this type of
right.
tool
So
set.
It used to be that you'd have to wait to get a new laptop to get the new version of Windows or the new version of Mac OS. Now these things just kind of happen in the background while you're sleeping, literally, on your phone or on your car or on your laptop. So I think that the world's expectations are different now than they were maybe 10 years ago. That said, when you're dealing with professional practice and deadlines and trying to control as much of your environment as possible, that could be disruptive. Absolutely. It's like, it even happens now, like in Teams or Zoom or Slack or anything else, any other tool that you're using, those things work this way too. They'll just push a new version out and you're like, wait, there's a new button here. All of a sudden, sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not. I think where it gets bad is when you have a software development team or a design team that doesn't understand the primary workflows and use cases that their audience are doing on a daily basis, so what they're getting paid to do. And if they start mucking around with those to the detriment because there's a shiny new feature that they want to add, that's when you start to get user animosity and sort of frustration around this thing. So I think it really does come back to a software design problem. Like, how do you add new capabilities without breaking the things that you have and without fundamentally changing the information architecture and like the layout, conceptual framework, object model of the system in a way that's disruptive and sort of breaks somebody's sort of patterns and paradigms. So I think you can do both, but you have to do it intentionally and make sure you listen to people's feedback. And that's actually another part of this whole thing, is that we're, because we have a lot of people that came from market engineering industry, we have a lot of connections in these partners. There's a good level of feedback back to us. It's not just we throw it over the wall and we don't listen. It's like they tell us like right away, basically, it's like, hey, you guys broke this thing and we'll fix it. So, but like often it can be done more intentionally in a thought provoking way. Like, I mean, just adding like AI ML tools is a great example. Like, there is a heavy emphasis on those, as you've seen in the marketplace now. And it's easy to we kind of see it in the same way that people kind of took sustainability to heart before and added features that might be green. But sometimes there's like sort of a greenification kind of problem. Like just because you added like an ecotech, like sun path diagram, doesn't mean you have a sustainable practice. Right. You know what I mean? So like, you're seeing the same thing from AI and ML standpoint right now. Just because you're using like, sort of Hugging Face or like some other like, image generation tool doesn't mean it's going to give you great results, or you really understand what's happening, or you're not violating, some copyright information. Like how do we apply these things intentionally and reasonably, and as an industry, and then also as a software provider, how do we provide things that are not gimmicky? They're not just to please the market or to make a new press release. They're impactful. They're designed intentionally to support or supplement or enhance a current process, as opposed to make it different just because it's different.
I'm curious how you engage with your audience. You mentioned feedback, but like, okay, so a new version of an app shows up on my phone, and we used to have to go through the process of like, okay, install the update, and where I could read the release notes, and then that's gone, right? Like nobody reads the release notes anymore. And I've seen a lot of companies now, because of the speed of development, they don't take the time to create documentation about here's how to use these new tools. Here's the new tools. Here's how to use them. And here's a place to provide feedback for them, because that's another job to do, right? I get it. So I'm just curious. Like, I've even seen software come out recently. It's like, there's no manual. You don't need it, right? And that may or may not be the case. Because it's so easy to use. And again, like, there's arguments there definitely is software like that. Does it exist in AEC? I don't know. But I'm curious how you guys are handling that, because this is just going to get more and more complicated over time. And if you don't have a system and you may have a different take on this than I do, but I feel like if you don't have a system now, when it's easy, and I'm using air quotes, podcasting air quotes, right, where you don't have a huge feature set, you're super focused, you're just trying to deliver kind of this baseline MVP kind of stuff, most valuable, like delivering value early. If you don't have that now, and maybe you do, but how do you do it later when it's even harder, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think it's very topical because we're about to launch the software, and usually documentation is the last thing that happens in anything. But luckily, it's the opposite for us, because we've been working with a set of people for the last 2 years. There is documentation, and there's one of the things that we find useful is writing design documents internally with intentionality ourselves. Like, if you can't convey a concept to someone internally in writing and make that point cleanly and clearly, your user's not going to understand it either. So we've written documents like since the beginning that describe how the software should work. the interesting thing now is that what you, the like any other design process, like your inputs go into this thing and there's a bunch of things that happen, and then what comes out the other end may not line up exactly with what your inputs were. So, but the intent is the same, where there is a concept like a frame, like we're looking at these presentation boards right now that we call frames. So there's a concept of a frame. Like, how should a frame work? Well, it should work like a slide in PowerPoint or like a sheet in Revit, where it's sort of like a container that holds stuff like views and, text and lines and whatever. So like that concept should be understandable and documented somewhere in a way that people can easily understand without reading a tome, like a large manual. So how do we do that? It's just going to be a lot of online resources that are contextual and relevant, where it's like, how do I do this? I want to do this thing. And from an end user standpoint, they don't really care if that's from documentation or from a community kind of forum or sort of Discord type thing, or if it's AI or if it's a help ticket. They just want an answer to their question.
Yeah.
Like, what is this thing? So that's very commonly what you see in software these days, is a little thing in the corner that literally lets you ask that question, like, how do I do this thing?
Those things in the corner are like totally invisible to a person like me. I never even, because I wasn't raised on this way of doing things, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like I learned a long time ago that the help menu was not that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I never even see those little things, that little bug in the corner like you're talking about. But I think what you're talking about, the next generation, and you're talking about people who operate software, that they're used to doing that.
But we do see different learning modalities, is like the fancy word for it. And some people learn better reading things. Other people learn better by looking at a video, watching YouTube or listening to a podcast. Like, so those kinds of things, I think we are investing in. So another good thing that happens in software is you can see where people go, right? So like the equivalent in architecture would be, if you're designing a campus for a college, right? You have a set of buildings, and you could design the quad, like the middle kind of grass area, and put paths down. But why not let people walk where they want to walk and then pave them the next year? So that's kind of how software works. Is like you can see where people go,
the heat
like
map, right?
Yeah, not like maliciously or like tracking or surveillance. It's just more like, you can look at that data and generate a heat map of like, where do people go? What questions do they ask? And then follow that with like, okay, this is clearly where they're going to ask that question. We should support that. And that really is that dialogue between like the software maker and then the end user. And to your point, like change happens, like, desktop software changes infrequently, but web software changes faster. But that doesn't have to be disruptive. It can actually be beneficial if you're listening and you're designing things with an intentional purpose.
I'm curious what you guys think about. There's this idea that I've had for a long time, and I'm sure I actually know that this is not my idea. It's not unique, but it's like certain things should have expiration dates, I think. Certain laws, like there's a lot of things out there. When it comes to tools and features and things like that, right? Like we all use software that's been around. You mentioned several titles that have been around forever, and they can never get rid of anything because somebody relies on that. I'm curious what your take is on that, because it seems to me like anything that really is going to be modern kind of has to think like that. Like there actually are, and if you're able to look at the data, right? If you're able to look and say, man, less than 1% does this thing anymore. And you guys are new. Maybe this doesn't apply to you yet. But it seems to me like there's some kind of expiration date on things. At least it's like, hey, let's revisit that and look at that again. Let's look at the data now and see where this feature sits, or, certain functionality or workflows or any of these things, because it's like in 20 years, if you're around then, right? Like you can see what happens. We all can see what happens, right?
Yeah, totally. I used to, like at Autodesk, like I used to work with guys like Ian Keogh and Anthony Hawk, and a bunch of us kind of worked together. And there was a point in time when I was not doing Revit anymore. I was doing Dynamo and computational stuff, whatever. But Anthony was the product manager for Revit at that time. And I got to say in customer meetings, it's probably my fault, but it's not my job to fix it anymore. Like there's some feature in Revit that didn't work or something like that. But those are very much those cases of like, when you design something, there's like literally a shelf life for it. It might have been a good idea at that time, but if it hasn't advanced in literally 15 years or 20 years, something's wrong. Like there should be a reductive process or a destructive process. If something's not used or it doesn't make sense, it should be taken out and recycled. It should be rebuilt. And there's a concept in software called the big ball of mud, which is about software accretion, both from a code base and sort of technology standpoint, but also from a user concept and feature standpoint. Like, why don't you take things away? Sometimes it's actually better for people to simply get rid of 5 things than to add 2 more. So that's a very strong concept that I don't think people actually embrace and think reductively. So like a good designer actually knows what to take away. And I don't think that that's applied very well in the software industry, but it should be.
I think that's one of Dieter Rams' like 10 principles of good design, right? It's
totally,
like, there's no extra, right?
Well, even back in the Renaissance days, like Michelangelo, like, how did you know what is David? Well, I took away everything that wasn't David, so it's okay. Yeah. Like, not to say that, like, but there's a level of self-critique and right. Honest feedback, and also just metrics, like the things we talked about before. If something's not being used, why should you have that cognitive load of literally even seeing that button or having that code in the code base? Like, just get rid of it. And that's hard to do sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, look at AutoCAD, right? Like just like how it's been around literally for like forever. And there, you try to take something away, and I guarantee you, because it's a horizontal piece of software that crosses so many industries, it's like, what are you talking about? I use that thing every single day, that tool. Somebody will raise their hand, right, and say, yeah, I use that every single day, because the user base is so big, it's been around for so long, and they just keep building and building and building and building. And then you get to the point where you cannot take stuff away because you're going to break somebody's. And I get it. Like, that's really hard to deal with. And at the same time, like, it's totally keeping us locked to these older systems. And so as a designer, as an architect, and kind of understanding that, yeah, like taking things away that don't serve us anymore, like that could serve us in so many ways in our lives. And yet it's very hard to kind of step back and gain that perspective and understand why that could be beneficial. Well, this has been a great conversation, and I'm excited with what you're showing at such an early stage. This has been, a great conversation to kind of talk about what it's like to work in this profession, and maybe for a next generation even more so. Like, I love that you guys are taking that perspective and not just trying to replace what exists today, but kind of redefine it and build something that will serve the future generations in a much more, useful way. So I appreciate you taking the time to share with us today.
Absolutely. And I think that's how we think about the company too, is that number one, like, we don't know all the answers. Like, we have some ideas, but we need to collaborate with people like thought leaders in the industry, like yourself and others, to find what's next. And we're trying to be humble about this stuff. Like, we know some things, but we don't know others. And we're trying to listen. Like, that's the fundamental thing, is when we work with a lot of these early adopter partners that we have, it's not us saying, here's the beautiful thing that we want to do. It's listening and observing and collaborating with people to find out what is next, and literally going on that journey together. So we've been doing that in a small forum recently over the last couple of years, but now it's time to go a little broader. So want to bring more people into that journey with us. So appreciate, having this conversation, and I'm sure we'll have more to talk about in the future.
Well, we'll have links in the show notes for this episode, but if you want to just say where people can go right now, if they're driving a car or whatever, and they this episode just delete as soon as it's over, it'd be better if you could just say it out loud.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Matt Jezyk. I'm from a company called Motif, and our website is Motif, MOTIF.io. You can find it online, and you'll be able to access the software, find out more about what we're up to. And we'd love to hear from you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. This has been a great conversation.
All right. Thanks a lot. See ya.